Welcome, everybody. It's Wednesday, and that means it's time for another MentorCore event. I'm Dan Ayala, one of the co-founders of MentorCore. By day, I'm a information security CISO and privacy officer. And by day, I'm the founder of this MentorCore, and the ability to take what I do every day and bring it to other people and try and share and meet and expand people's networks and get to have great conversations with people in the industry of security, compliance, risk, privacy, ethics, governance has been a delight. We're coming up on about a year of having done this. And never enjoyed it more. I haven't enjoyed it more. I keep enjoying it more and more every time. My partner in Not Crime, Lisa Beth Lentini Walker. Hi, Lisa. How are you?
Hi, how are you doing today?
I'm
Uh,
good, thanks.
I love our MentorCore events, and today we have a very special one with Janelle. So my name's Lisa Beth Lentini Walker. I am a compliance ethics and corporate governance strategist. I run the firm Lumen Worldwide Endeavors. I'm also a lawyer and I teach law school in the United States and Europe. And what I love doing is helping to build communities and connect people. So MentorCore is one of those places. Dan and I decided to bring together all of these groups of compliance, security, and risk because we saw so much overlap, convergence, ways that we need to help support each other, and opportunities for learning, networking, mentoring that needed to be explored. So we started this series, and we're just thrilled to have Janelle with us today. Welcome, Janelle. Please tell us a little bit about you.
Well, thank you, Dan and Lisa. I'm honored to be here. And yeah, I got connected through the compliance and security networking events that you guys had put on. And just think it's a fabulous, community of people to talk to and to network with and actually, kind of grow the community. So I'm Janelle Shaw. I'm the founder and president of Privacy Swan Consulting. And I started implementing IT systems back in the 1990s, but always with an eye towards security and privacy. And then in 2008, I founded my own consulting company focused on SMBs and helping them become successful. And that eventually landed me 100% into IT, security and privacy. And then I fell in love with GDPR. And from there, I've actually gone full bore into privacy. But because I come from technology and security, I bring that to the table whenever I talk about privacy. And I always look at it from like business and technical perspective. So I'm not a lawyer. So I usually say that if you don't want to implement something, I'll call a lawyer to kind of help you figure out how not to do it. But if you want to do it and you want to be privacy preserving, then that's actually, my sweet spot. So
Nice.
Terrific. Yes,
Do you get
lawyers are good for some things.
things. In fact, I could use one today. I'm working on a contract. So yeah.
I
There you go.
guarantee there's a few on here.
Yeah.
Do you get the same funny looks that I do when you say I love GDPR? Because
I do.
I say the same thing and I get this crazy look. People always look at me like I'm crazy.
For me, it's because it's the carrot and the stick, right? Coming from technology and security, I love that it has, the privacy by design, data protection by design, data protection by default, has security requirements in it. But it's also holistic. It's the privacy. It's about a person's privacy. And so that's where I love both ends of it. And then we have the fine. So it's an enforcement regulation that companies are actually willing to invest money in. So for
Yeah.
me, that's the love I have for it.
And as we'll talk about in a couple minutes, we're definitely starting to see the implications of GDPR starting to materialize in how business happens. But
Yeah.
first, let's start with the worlds of security and privacy. You spent time in both of those worlds. And last night I was on a panel discussion with other CISOs, and I got asked the question. And as soon as I heard it, I said, this is one I want to ask Janelle tomorrow. The question came up about where privacy belongs in an organization and whether or not security and privacy are destined to come together. What do you think? What's your take on that?
So yeah, this is a question we all get asked, right? And so I'm going to take a little bit of a different spin before I dive into the specific suggestion or recommendation. And I always talk about privacy being about people. And security is really about the organization, and that people can only be as secure as the options provided by the organization. And that people should get to choose the data that they provide to the organizations. And right now, people aren't provided the choices, and most organizations don't have great security, right? So, again, if you think of privacy as about the person, and we could talk about privacy principles, the fact that privacy is contextual, but if you think about it's the data about a person, and security is really about protecting it. And when I talk to most security professionals, they want to encrypt it. They want to put it
Right.
behind the firewall, right? They want to put it in a box and not let it leave. But what I ask is, I'm like, should you have collected that data to begin with? Did you need that data, right? Should you be processing that data? Should you be sharing that data? And if you look at the Cambridge Analytica thing with Facebook, like, should they have collected that data? Yes, you can do that, right? But should you have done that is the question. And so, from my perspective, if we can get security professionals to think about the people, and not just security professionals, but organizations, to think about privacy as data about people. So a lot of the regulations have data subject or consumer, or and I say people. Like, I say, how about we use mother? Would you want your mother's data to be that way? Or, like, would you want your daughter's data on that website? Or would you collect that much data about your daughter and then send it to Cambridge Analytica? Like, let's think about that. So I first kind of always try and frame it as the difference between security and privacy. But then your question was, how do we see them interacting and merging together?
Or do we?
We do. And I think we do because we're starting to see, like, the Nist framework. So Nist has the CSF, and they launched the privacy framework last year. So we're seeing those coming together. And we see the same thing with ISO. So ISO, we've had 27001 around for a long time. And we recently, I think it was in 2019, they put out the 27701, which is the privacy controls. And if you're familiar with SOC 2, right, those trust criterias, they've also had privacy controls. Most companies just figured out the security ones, but in the last couple of years, people are starting to implement the privacy ones. So I absolutely think that they're coming together, and we're seeing that from all the frameworks and from industry trying to integrate them.
Yeah, and I think the one of the other pieces of advice from spending time that I was given from spending time in Europe was the idea of not thinking about it as much as privacy, but rather as data protection. And it starts to make that inevitable path quite a bit clearer by using those words and encouraging others to use those words.
Yeah, and so under European regulation, privacy is distinctly different from data protection.
Right.
And so here in the United States, we talk about privacy, but again, I think whether it's privacy or the European data protection, we have to think about it as people. And that's, from a GDPR perspective, going back to the Declaration of Human Rights, right? Like, that's kind of the cornerstone of where that starts from. And it's a fundamental human right. I can launch into my whole dissertation on how privacy isn't in the Constitution, and is it really in any of the privacy laws? It's not even in HIPAA. Like, we could go that route, but
Yeah, it's a tougher path in the US for sure. It's a
Yeah.
much different set of set of mindsets.
I think it absolutely is. But, one of the things that's interesting about the United States is what I'm seeing is more and more consumer protection regulators are starting to get into the mix, so that it's becoming a consumer protection issue
Mhm.
rather than being couched as a privacy issue. And I think that there's a big difference between the how and the what. Like,
yep.
how do you do it versus what exactly are the standards, and how do you design your values to be in alignment with what they're talking about?
And I would take it a step further and to say why.
Yeah.
So why is the regulation in place, right? Because GDPR and some of the, if we look at Canadian privacy regulations, and in Australia, they're in place to protect the person. And here, why are those laws in place? They're, in my opinion, they're in place to protect the organization so that they can share data legally.
Right.
So that
Yeah.
why I go back to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to watch over the next, say, 4 years to see if that why starts shifting a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're right, Janelle. You know, even with Virginia's new law that got signed in last night, you know, it is very much it's a great move forward here, but it is right. It's very much about organization, not necessarily about people.
Yeah, and I think the only way that we're gonna, in my opinion, fix part of this problem of data collection and the monetization of data. And I'm actually doing a presentation in a couple of weeks on stop tracking me, like on this tracking, is to get companies to understand that it's about data. It's about the person. It's about the person's data. And I don't know if that that's a big lift.
So thinking about that in that same vein, you know, privacy is increasing in visibility in the forefront of business. I don't know if you saw, but this morning, Google announced that they were going to end their use of personalized advertising, and they even came out a little bit further and said, you know, when the skeptics like me came out and responded and said, okay, so you're just going to move to something else, the response was, no, we're not moving beyond the cookie. We're not looking at alternative tracking mechanisms. You know, there's of course the thought that does this mean that personalized advertising is not as effective as everyone claims it was or wanted it to be? But this is clearly privacy is part of this, or is it? Is privacy part of this decision?
I mean, I think so. I also think it has to do with Australia's looking at monetizing the network or the news outlets. And I may not have that 100% correct, but I know that Facebook, they're not happy with that because they want to continue to monetize the data. And Google was like, absolutely, like we'll figure out how this works. And I think that it goes back to that why. Why is Australia doing that? And why is Google decided to jump on the bandwagon of stop monetizing the data? And so part of it is business model, and part of it is Google wants to be, I mean, they want it, they're everywhere, right? Who doesn't have a Gmail account or use, some Google search? But, I think that going back to why they're doing that, I think consumers are asking for that, right? Like people are really saying, we don't want to be tracked. We don't want our every, I call it thought, word, and deed, being known and track and not only tracked, but captured, right? Like it's recorded for however long that the company decides to record it for. But then
usually infinity,
right? Unless you have a data destruction policy,
unless
right?
you can figure out how to get out of it. Yeah.
Right. It's interesting because there is a fellow by the name of Roger McNamee who wrote the book Zucked. And I heard him speaking once, and he said that one of the games he plays is, can you stay away from the big tech, Google, Facebook, etc., and how long can you? And most people can't make it more than a day. Most people can't make it more than a day.
Yeah, and there was actually, I want to say from the New York Times, one of their, sorry, I just changed my screen. One of their journalists actually she had her technical team shut off access to the big five and to see how she could live, and it was really difficult. So that's was a really good expose as well. They're everywhere.
Yeah, I think that was Joanna Stern. Might have been Joanna Stern. But yeah, it was a very interesting. It's everywhere. But then that bodes the question of, they don't have to. If you have that level of ubiquity, you don't have to do this for the consumer. Back to your point earlier, Janelle, this isn't necessarily about the people. It's about is it about the organization? Is it about the FTC? Is it about the EC that's looking into antitrust? Is that the motivator?
I mean, for Google to do this? I mean, I think that Google is hopefully seeing the writing on the wall, that this is going to be demanded more and more. And then like for me, I don't use Chrome. I use Brave and I use Firefox. So, market share could also be a potential impetus for the change.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
absolutely. And people are becoming more aware of it. Ad blockers are becoming easier to install. It's easier to people. Apple is making major changes to browsers and phones to make the technology that's in use for cross tracking. Maybe they're reading the writing on the wall that says, this cat and mouse is going to continue. Let's not engage in the game. I'm
Yeah.
I'm okay with that because the end, like I said, the end result, the what ends up being the same. The how is different.
Yeah. And yeah, I think for whatever reason, the why Google is doing it, I think, we can hope that it's gonna be for the best. And that I'm always skeptical that there's maybe another hidden, like,
The shoe that's
yeah,
waiting.
there you go, the shoe that may potentially drop next. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, not so good. Yeah, it's clear that people are that there's lack of trust with these organizations.
Yeah.
For sure.
So we shall
And I
see
think,
we'll see what materializes. But
yeah.
let's talk about you. Let's talk about Privacy Swan Consulting. And this is you said you've been doing your own consulting for quite some time. Can you tell me a little bit about the path that you've taken to get there? How did you get there? And when did you say, and what made you say, consulting, this is what I want to do and I want to do it my way?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I, started in technology, and, was full bore doing the regular 50, 60-hour work weeks. And, I've loved almost every job I've had. But then when I had kids, or we adopted our kids, I was like, I knew I couldn't be the kind of mom that could dedicate 50 hours a week. And, and she's not listening, but I have a challenging daughter. She's 1,000 times better. But I mean, it was a tough go. And so to have a child who has that tough go, you have to make choices. And so I chose to step away from the corporate career, and I never quit working, but I started part-time, learned some different skills. And my job had always been consulting. I had always been the person who they would fly across the country to solve a problem or do requirements gathering. And then I had a friend who was kind of in the same boat, and she's like, well, let's start a consulting company together. And I was like, okay. And we were sitting at like Starbucks, and we're sitting there. She goes, well, who's going to pay us? And I said, oh, sweetie, we only eat what we kill. She goes, you mean nobody's going to pay us? And I said, no, as a consultant, we have to go find the work. And so she went and found a job. And I was left going, okay, I will do this by myself. So I never intended to do it by myself. And 13 years later, still doing it by myself. So yeah.
That's
Well,
amazing. So, quick question for you. How'd you come up with Privacy Swan?
That's a great question too. So as a trusted advisor, I always tell companies that I work under two principles. One is eyes wide open. So I try and make sure that when they make a decision, I have given them all the information they need to make that decision. And the other one is sleep well at night. Where I tell companies, like, if you give me problems, or your employees give me problems, or you just tell me what's keeping you up at night. Sometimes I start engagements that way too. I said, one of two things are going to happen. I'm going to tell you, oh, that we know how to solve for that problem, and this is what it is. Or I'll say, you know what? Let's talk about this. Let's figure out what the problem is, and let's solve for that. Either way, you'll sleep well at night. And so SWAN is an acronym for sleep well at night.
Nice.
So
That's
it's all acronym.
fantastic.
Yeah, everybody thinks I like swans. I'm like, no, it's an acronym. I don't know how to make that clearer. Like, it's an acronym. Sleep
S
well at
period
night.
W
Yeah.
period A
It's
Thank
a
you.
period.
great acronym.
I
It
love
is
it.
a great acronym, and it actually, I think, goes very well with kind of your brand and your purpose. So, a quick question for you. Um, a lot of people who call into this have thought about consulting. How do you find clients? because I know that's one of the big questions everyone has, and there are a little bit different answers for that everybody gives. So I'd love to hear yours.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was really fortunate to start 13 years ago. I didn't so, and I Privacy Swan is actually a rebranding. The company I'm incorporated under is called Tailored Office Solutions, LLC. So Tossel is that company, and the idea was that I mean, I'm kind of a Jill of all trades. So like I've done a little bit everywhere, and I can solve big business problems. And I know I have a great network, so I can usually find somebody if I don't know the answer. So I never had a website, I never marketed, I never did anything until I rebranded to Privacy Swan Consulting. And so how do you find clients? I think it's networking. Like I do intentional networking. I try to attend 1 to 2 networking events a week. I'm part of 4 or 5 different associations. I volunteer my time a lot to different organizations, and not to find clients. And I think that's the other, secret too, is that I don't intentionally go looking for clients, and I don't say, oh, you know what, I'm going to go talk to Dan because I think he's going to make I don't operate that way. I try and have good advice. I try really to be accessible so that people are comfortable coming to me asking questions, and then sometimes it will lead to an engagement. But I think it's intentional networking, and then networking. I don't network with people that I know.
Mm-hmm.
I So when I go to a networking event, if I know you, you'll think I'm rude. So I go and I talk to the people I don't know. And then they're like, we saw you at the event last night. This was when we could do them in person. Um, you know, but I try and talk to people I don't know. And even on Zoom calls, like when I'm on Zoom calls with people I know, I'll try and reach out to somebody that I don't know.
That's
That's
great.
that's
And going
really
back to,
interesting advice. Yeah, go
yeah, it
ahead, Dan.
is. And the just to reference back, our all of our mutual friend Douglas Brush was on about, it was almost a year ago, and we were talking about giving to get. And I think that's you spend the time in these groups not because of what you'll get out of it, but
Right.
because it's about giving, because it's about taking and helping to pave the way for, in the way that people paved the way for us. And the end result may be that something comes out of it, but you don't go in with that intention. So it was a really good discussion that we had with him about a year ago. So I just posted that into the chat, and recommend that watch for anybody that's interested in the topic.
Yep.
Yes.
So how do you stay connected to the rest of the community? And back to that original question around security and privacy, and these things coming together, you're primarily focused on the privacy, but how are you staying connected with both the security and privacy communities?
Yeah, so it's funny because I actually spend more time networking with security professionals because I'm not a lawyer and I come from that technical and security background, and I'm actually more comfortable in that environment. And so that's where I spend my time. And I don't want to talk to people who already know what I'm talking about. Like I don't need an echo chamber. I want to talk to people who don't know what GDPR is, who don't know what privacy is, right? Who don't understand the harms that can happen to people by over collection, oversharing, of that data. So as far as like I do a lot of associations. There, in my opinion, there's really good associations that you can reach out to and become a member of. And so I do more of those than the privacy events.
So you have a a strong interaction with attorneys in this world, and you mentioned earlier that yeah that you both need them, in what you do. You also work with them. um, Tell me, this question comes up a lot around privacy, the especially for those that are not attorneys, how to build good relationships with the attorneys that are doing privacy, in order to keep those. We can't finalize things in the way an attorney would, but having people around us that can. How have you been able to build up some of those relationships, and get to a good mutual point of understanding and trust, to be able to work together with attorneys in the space?
Yeah, I think it's going back to that giving what you get, or whatever Doug's phrase was,
Give
right?
to
Like
get,
what
yeah.
give to get. Yeah. I mean, whenever I come to the table with an attorney, it's a give and take. So it's not, it's trying to understand what they need from the conversation, what the contract needs to say, and how I can bridge that gap for them in the contract. But then also on the flip side, helping understand from a legal perspective, like what legally do we have to comply to from, security, technology, and privacy. So I think it's going into it with that open mind, and that I don't like the zero sum game. I really believe that we can have a win-win conversation, and I always go into it with an optimistic attitude. Where I'm like, okay, we're going to solve this problem, and I think all problems are solvable. You may not like the solution or the answer, but there is going to be, I say that, no answer is an answer. Like if your kids don't answer you, well, guess what? They made their choice. They're not going, they're
Right.
not getting
Mhm.
it, whatever. So no is an answer. So that's how, I guess, when I work with attorneys, I mean, I see them as people, and people who need things, people who I can help, and they're going to help me, and hopefully we have a common goal to get to the end of whatever the discussion or conversation is.
And just for clarification, the fact, to those that are not actively in these kind of relationships, quite candidly, the attorney and attorney and non-attorney privacy practitioner relationship is one that I've heard. I've been lucky in my relationships with either in-house counsel or external counsel on these spaces, but I know a lot of people do have there's friction, there's domain questions. Who owns it? Does legal own privacy? Does legal not? Does technology own
Mhm.
privacy? And so, the reason I bring this question up is because I'm well aware that there are these conflicts that exist, and I think Janelle's answer about how to come to this idea of no zero sum is really important, because the outcome is the outcome is really what we're all after, not about you know turf and domain and scope.
Right.
And I think on that same point, I would say respect.
Yeah.
And I think there's something, this is a word that gets tossed around a lot, is swim lanes, right?
Hmm.
Like I also think if you're talking about specifically an organization, that you need to figure out what swim lane you're in, and respect the swim lane that you're in. And when I work with organizations, incident response is the biggest one that I think, from a security, privacy, legal, like everybody wants their hands in incident response.
Right.
Um, and then I would actually add another layer to respect to experience. I was working with an organization, and they were really having a hard time with drawing the lines on their incident response plan. And their chief marketing officer, she came to one of our tabletop exercises, and she's like, you know what? I used to do incident response for the Olympics. I was like, you are our commander. And they're like, I got such pushback. They're like, she's marketing. I was like,
Who
she's
cares?
done incidents at the
She knows her
level that,
stuff.
and
Exactly.
she was like, oh, absolutely. Like I would totally do that. And so she had that in her wheelhouse. So sometimes I think it's also asking the question, hey, who's done incident response, or who's done, data subject access requests is the big one right now, right? Like
Mhm.
you might be surprised who in your organization has this experience. And I would leverage that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Especially
mean,
especially people who have done pieces of it as not formally part of their roles, but maybe more experience than they themselves realize in some of these things.
yeah, I think, look, at the end of the day, you have to bring people who have talent, and enthusiasm for this. There are certain things that are going to have to go in certain directions. Like, you know, security, you're going to need somebody who's technical to
Right.
help with that, right? Forensics, technical. Um, Legal and notifications, probably a lawyer.
Mhm.
So there are definite swim lanes, but there are lots of areas where you just want people who are competent, organized, who care, who may have experience, and maybe not traditional experience. Maybe it's a little bit different. But just because someone has a marketing title doesn't mean that they're, you know, out of the running to be a really critical player in this space.
And heck, they're also going to help make sure you communicate this stuff well, which is something that
Correct.
all of us need help on.
Yep, absolutely.
100%.
Yep.
So, we talk. So actually, let me bring up a question that came up in the chat. You had talked about organizations that you participate in, and the question was asked, quite succinctly. What are the organizations you think are important to join in the privacy world, or in any of this space?
Yeah.
Privacy, compliance, ethics.
Yeah, and I think it depends on your objective. I think that you have to define why you're going to join the organization. I think that there's so many out there that you yourself have to be clear on your objective. And so my objective for joining organizations is to meet people that I don't know. And it's to bring privacy to people who don't know privacy. So I love the IAPP. I'm an authorized training partner of the IAPP. I have shelves of IAPP textbooks. Like, I am IAPP champion girl, but I don't attend a lot of their events because they don't need what I have to offer, right? I have friends there that I, high five, but so I intentionally, going back to my objective when I attend a group, is to talk to them about something they don't know. I want to bring something to the table that's unique. So I actually am part of ISSA. So it's an international security, I forget the acronym, they're going to kill me. But ISSA.org is the organization. And I actually, last year with 3 other people, started the privacy special interest group for the international organization, because I intentionally want to bring privacy to, ISSA.org. Because that's a space that they didn't have that. And so I worked with them to do that. And then the other one that I'm a part of is CSA, so Cloud Security Alliance. And I love their mission and vision as well, is to bring security cloud, to secure the cloud. And everything right now is in the cloud, whether you like it or not. And so with intentionality, I joined Cloud Security Alliance. Again, they are very technical, and I always get something out of it, but not being as super technical as I was 20 years ago. My objective for attending that is to bring them. So I still speak. I am actually speaking there in a couple of weeks. But when I spoke there for the first time 4 years on privacy, there was only like 20 people that came. And then 3 years ago, there was 40 people that came. And then last year, before we got shut down, I was fortunate to speak in February, and it was a packed house, right? So like chipping away at this message that I have on privacy for the security and technical community is finally paying off.
It's
Last night, that
interesting.
panel I referenced last night was CSA as well, and the move of security practitioners to better understand privacy is it's formidable.
Yep.
So interestingly enough, we've got a couple of other people who are chatting here. Number one, people love the meaning of the SWAN acronym. I think that's a winner chicken dinner. So they're thanking you for that. And then there was some commentary as well on privacy by design and how it seems to be morphing a little bit, but it would be great for it not to be an afterthought, which is kind of the exact opposite of what privacy by design is meant to do. How are you seeing that change over time in terms of privacy by design?
I love, and we're going to call it data protection by design. So how I've seen it advance over time. So the privacy by design principles were by Anne Kavoukian, the Canadian data protection commissioner. And so she has the principles that are kind of nebulous, and they're hard to implement. But not recently, actually, there's a movement to making privacy by design actually have technical strategies and tactics. And there's a couple researchers that are really spending a lot of time and energy in this. So if you are interested in privacy by design or data protection by design, there's a ton of really good resources to help organizations not have it be a policy and a procedure or something nebulous, but to actually have strategies and tactics that can be implemented to help preserve privacy. I mean, I could say it needs to be added at the beginning and not at the end. It could be all of these things. But I strongly encourage people to think outside the box, go outside your comfort zone, and research actual privacy by design strategies. And there's a technology called PETs, so privacy enhancing technologies. If you don't know what pets are and you're in privacy, security, and technology, I'd say Google it. Because
But I thought we were trying to avoid the big
I know.
five.
Okay, brave it, or actually
DuckDuckGo it.
DuckDuckGo it. Yeah, DuckDuckGo it. But privacy enhancing technologies, these are technologies that are designed to preserve people's privacy, but still give them the utility. I recently posted that GDPR isn't the regulation of no, and I got slammed. And they're like, we can't do this, we can't do that. You can't. I said, yes, you can. You can do it fairly, transparently, with the person in mind. It's not a regulation of no, it's a regulation of how can we do this to preserve the privacy. So privacy enhancing technology, if you're into privacy by design. And then the author, there's a gentleman that I work with, Jason Kronk. I'll give him a shout out. So he is the author of Strategic Privacy by Design. And if you don't have that book, I have a couple copies, but Strategic Privacy by Design.
And Dan will get it in the chat. He's really good at making sure we got all the references in the chat.
Yep. And again, it is technical. Yeah, it's a technical implementation of privacy.
So interestingly enough, and I'd love your take on this, one of the conversations that I have had recently is around the emergence, or actually the dawning awakening and awareness of the general public to environmental social governance principles and where privacy plays into that. Now, I've heard a couple of people say, well, ESG, it's missing the T for technology, or ESG, it's missing the D for data. But, I would love your take on whether you think that some of the new awareness and media focus starts to help privacy and security use language that is resonating with stakeholders.
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned, 4 years ago when I spoke, nobody came, and now all of a sudden everybody does. And when I do my trainings, or even if I do a presentation, you just open up the newspaper and then you have 4 or 5 articles that you can reference that day that are so relevant. So I absolutely agree that, it's starting to become a mainstream topic. And it goes back to awareness. I don't think we can solve a problem unless people have awareness that there is a problem. And I think that's been the problem with privacy. People didn't know all the data that was being collected on them. They didn't know that, that every app on your cell phone is collecting information whether you want it to or not. And until we got transparency and into that it was happening, then we can translate that into awareness. It's very rare for me to find people now who don't know that Facebook is tracking them. But still they use it, right? And so
then they're making a conscious decision about what they do or don't do.
Right. Or then we get into what's called this privacy paradox, right? Where people want this level of privacy, but their behavior says they'll do this because they want to use that product. And so, there's this paradox of what we want versus what we are willing to give up for whatever the product is.
Which is very similar to kind of ethical rationalization, which is, this is the ethics that I say that I have, but I'm willing to do all of this other stuff because what I really want is maybe not aligned to that.
Right.
And a great quote that I heard within the last week was, you respond to what you know, what you've learned, experienced, and what you've learned. And I think that's true for privacy and security too. I think it kind of goes across the board. Like you have to know it to see to spot it. You have to, have experienced it to be able to relate to it. And, then you have to learn a little bit more to get savvy about it.
I mean, I think absolutely. And for me, I'm the other thing that I spend a lot of my time on, in addition to, tracking me, is the algorithms, right?
Hmm.
Because I think that, kind of what you described is exactly what's happening in the world of algorithms, right? Until people became aware of the data that was being used in them and how they were learning, you can't fix that problem.
Right. Right. There's a lot of algorithmic bias, both because of data sets and in design.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, that's yeah, the ethics and the digital ethics piece I think is as much on a collision path with this space as security and privacy are together.
Hmm.
They are the conversations are naturally morphing into one another. I don't know if you're seeing the same things, Janelle.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very difficult to have a conversation without talking about diversity and inclusion. Because I think that one of the reasons we're in the space that we're in, or we're in the issues that we have today, is because we didn't have enough diverse voices um, to 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 say something about that. And to raise their hand and go, hey, I think there's a problem, or oh, I see this differently. And if we would have had that, 20, 30 years ago from a technology perspective, I don't think we would be kind of so boxed in as we are with some of the technical choices that were made that, 20, 30 years ago.
And I think that leads to, I think, another topic that I'd love to dive into is some of the challenges that we have in the security space around hiring, around diversity within the, not just within the data sets and the algorithms, but within the people that work in the field. Um, so we hear a lot about people complaining or having difficulty about the entry process into security and into privacy. How are and compliance as well? How are people getting into the privacy field? How are they getting into? Are they preparing? How are they growing to come into the privacy arena? Is there a well-trodden path in? And once you're in, are there any paths upward?
Yeah, well-trodden paths. I'm going to say no, that none that I know of.
There's
And
no,
I
yeah, there's no textbook formula. Do this and you'll get in. Yeah.
Yeah, well, unless you're a privacy lawyer, there's kind of a track for that.
Yep.
But I
Yeah.
think for practitioners, I think it's kind of the same as security, right? Like it's one of these things where, for me, it was privacy was something that no one else wanted to do. So working with 853 Rev 4, right? Privacy was Appendix J, right? It was that add-on.
Right.
No, nobody wanted to talk about it. And so it was raising my hand saying, hey, I'll do that. And then Privacy Shield, hey, I'll do that. And then finally GDPR, so it's always raising my hand saying I'll do that. So from how do you get into the field, I do think you have to be brave, and raise your hand and say, I'm willing to go outside my comfort zone, and I'm going to solve this problem for the organization.
Yeah, and be ready and able to take the pushback that comes with it, because privacy is often the unpopular answer right now. Because again, I'll come back to the US, where there's a lot of push toward growth, toward business growth, toward revenue growth, reporting to the street on a regular basis, and data. The old Economist article keeps coming back. Data is the new oil. Um, so it's not always the easy path either when you raise your hand.
I would say trust is the new currency. I would say
I
that.
agree.
I like that better than data is oil, because
Yeah.
I think it's trust. And I think that's what's going to happen with organizations. I mean, with individuals, is that, we vote with our wallets. And even though, like Facebook, obviously there's not a monetary cost, there is, well, right. They monetize it.
Yeah.
But I do think that as consumers, we are starting to gravitate towards the companies that don't exploit us.
Yeah,
And
the
kind of
values
back,
buyer is
yeah,
definitely a real thing.
yeah, yep. And I think that we need to advocate for the companies that are willing to not exploit the users whose data they collect.
Mm. So you're also part of the security career connection, which you mentioned earlier, and its partner, the compliance career connection. And thank you for being part of it. We've recently started the first group networking event, and we're working on some more. And despite it being called security career connection, it absolutely includes privacy, and then you've attended both in the privacy realm, both the compliance and the security. So if you're interested, I put the link in earlier in the chat. But how have you been able to leverage mentoring and networking to grow your own career?
That's a great question. I think it goes back to networking. Like I feel like I'm sort of a connector,
Mm-hmm.
a networker by just naturally. So when I hear stories, I kind of, try and connect them with other people that I think they'll have a common interest or something that can benefit. So, I think from my perspective, it's always keeping an ear open for like who can I connect, and oh, I think they'd work really well together, or oh, I hear somebody's looking for a job and I know they have a job. And I think that it's always trying to find those matches, and always being open, right? Like um always being open to networking events and to taking calls. So like even this week, I'm talking to two different people who reached out to me through the different networking events that I'm part of, just wanting advice, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's also making time to take calls for people who are looking for help.
Yeah, and I mean, if your past is anything like mine, the reason I am where I am today is because people did the same for me.
Mhm.
You know, Lisa Beth and I were talking about that before you joined, and I wish I could say the same, Dan.
Really
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yes.
interesting.
I would say that I have not had,
One of these things is not like the others.
Oh,
yeah,
Hands down
wow.
more
Okay.
mentoring opportunities than Janelle
yeah,
and I.
I would say that hard work, positive attitude, tenaciousness, but I
Mm-hmm.
would not add mentor to the list of people who helped me until recently. And I
Okay.
think it's because
I
I
would
have,
agree.
until I changed um, what my definition of mentor was. But yeah, I would say not a lot of support coming up.
No, well, thank you for sharing that. That's great to know, and not great that it was that way, but but the other nice part is that you're breaking that cycle. You're contributing forward, and it will help the next generation of people. And maybe that is why we have some of the disparity issues that we have coming into the field as up to now. But it is really nice. A discussion doesn't happen with one or two or three of us in which the topic, like you said, of DEI, of mentoring, of growth, and bringing new people into the field doesn't, it automatically becomes part of the conversation. So thank you
Yeah.
for that. Do you have any advice for people coming into the field? um how can they look at privacy versus the rest of the world? Is there anything unique about the privacy realm that people need to keep in mind as they're coming into it?
It's changing faster than security, I would say, and
Yeah.
that frequently I have to say, I hold on, let me check. Because the other thing, so I would say from a privacy perspective, I'm going to quote a friend of mine. He recently said that we're snowblind. Like there's so many laws and regulations, and even with CCPA or CPRA, like the changes are so fast and furious. I literally cannot keep up.
Right.
And so it's not uncommon if I'm giving a class or a training or a presentation where someone's like, "Oh, you got that fact wrong." I'm like, probably, because if I'm trying to be that specific with some of the laws. So I would say from a privacy perspective, you kind of have to get used to being uncomfortable in the fact that it's always changing. And then the other piece with privacy is it's contextual. So what a privacy program looks like in one organization is going to be very different than a, a second organization, from their risk tolerance to their use of data, to how the quality that they have, people that they have, different programs. So kind of this, I'm never comfortable. Whereas in security, I was very comfortable. Like I knew what my controls were, I knew how to implement them,
Right.
I knew, like I was really comfortable walking into a meeting saying this. In privacy, I feel less confident. I'm still, there's less of that of certainty.
Right. Yeah. How long did it take for NIST 853 to go from R4 to R5? 5 years, I think.
Yeah,
So, that's the pace of change. Granted, the attacks are changing,
right.
but the fundamental premises, don't evolve quite like they are in the world around us, like privacy is. I'd be lost without my without Bloomberg law or its equivalents
Yes.
feeding me the current changes in what's going on.
Yeah.
Bloomberg law is not a sponsor.
That's just a preference Dan has. So we're coming to the end of our time together, and this has been so much fun. But I want to make sure that we take a moment to just ask our signature question, which is, what's the best advice you ever received from a mentor?
Yeah. So going back to, I kind of want to just go back to the fact that I didn't have a lot of great mentors growing up. And Lisa Beth, you kind of started to jump in there too. So, like, was that the experience that you had to kind of throw it back at the interviewer?
So, it's interesting. When I think about mentors that kind of looked like me, had similar experiences to me, I didn't have a lot of those. I didn't know anyone who was in the profession that I was in, had kids, and was a woman. Um, so most of the people who I connected with as mentors were people who I met along the way who, they never called themselves mentors, but they helped teach me things. I learned things along the way. And so I, over time, changed this concept that somehow a mentor had to be older or had to, be advocating for me, etc. That's more kind of like of a sponsorship model. And I started to look at all the different relationships that I had. I didn't have what I had grown up thinking a mentor was, but I had lots of people who cared about me and were helping me along the way. They may not have been in a position of power to influence where I wanted to get, or they may not have been necessarily older, quote unquote, wiser than me, but they were all doing things to help me along the way. Right. So I had to expand my concept of what mentoring was and what that kind of relationship looked like, because I realized that I was learning something from people, whether they were, newer to the profession, were peers, etc. So um, I I didn't have the experience that I thought I was looking for, but I had an experience that had multiple experiences that I needed.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer, and I would agree with you that I had a lot of great people supporting me, and never felt like I didn't have support. But yeah, it's that nobody to actually like give me that opportunity to that next rung sort of mentor. But I think to answer your question, Dan, I have two, so I'm going to kind of cheat. I hope that's okay. The
Oh, I'm
first
sorry. Only one per customer. No, we'll give you two. Go for it.
so the first one is my mom, actually. I admire her so much. And hers was, she would always say, why not you? She was like, we grew up kind of poor, not a lot of money, not a lot of social status. And she was like, why not you? You can do whatever you want. So she always was there to say, absolutely, take the shot, do it. But then on the flip side, she'd always say, well, why not you for getting cancer too, right? So she would bring you down to earth a little bit too, like, why not you, not you didn't get the job, like. So it was this idea of just like, you can do anything that you want to do, like, why not you? And so I hear myself saying that to my kids frequently, of why not you. So I would say that was actually, she was my biggest cheerleader. But then I did have somebody who I worked with who was a great boss, and he would always say, fair is not equal. So it's not about being equal, it's about being fair. And that has resonated with me forever and ever. And I think this really, when we look at diversity inclusion, we look at privacy and security, we look at everything that I do, I use that a lot. Because it's not about being equal. We're not created equal. We don't all have equal talents, but we do know what fair looks like. Kind of harkening back to what Lisa Beth said, like, you know it when you see it, right? And we intuitively know what's fair and what's not fair, whether you vocalize it or not. You know if it's fair. And so I love how equal is not fair.
Yeah, and I think we've just to because I'll never stop referring back to other guests we've had as well. Michael
Carter.
Michael Carter, the difference between that there is a distinct difference between equity and equality. And we hear this in the in the education space as well. People say they want equity, but what they really do end up doing is equality, and it doesn't necessarily interchange. So I
Yep.
totally love I love that, Janelle. That's really great advice.
Yep.
Well, we really appreciate you being here today. It has been a wonderful session. We, love that you've shared so much of your path and your experiences throughout this, journey. Everybody's going to remember Privacy Swan, that it's not actually a swan. But we really appreciate everything that you're doing to kind of pay it forward, get back to the community, show people that, maybe there's somebody in our audience who is thinking right now, golly, I'm so glad I heard you speak, because you look like me, you sound like me, you have the same story as me, and now they know that they too can have a career in security and privacy, and that privacy and security actually can get along, and probably should a little bit
They,
better.
they probably should. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you
So
so
thank
much
you.
for having me on. Yeah, no, it was a lot of fun, and I really appreciate it. And I love the Mentor Core, mission, and all the hard work that you guys have done as well. Like, I think, we can't move forward without people like you guys, helping to grow and it could, adhere the community.
Thanks so much, Janelle.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate that. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. We're at the end of our time. So we hope you have a great rest of the day. And we'll see you next time for another Mentor Core event.